what kind of container can you build where either the heat of the star doesn't destroy the container or the container doesn't extinguish the star? The work that Philo T. Farnsworth did, he developed a nuclear fusion process. So this is the man who had in fact invented television, and he takes that knowledge to try to develop controlled nuclear fusion. Every video screen on the planet can trace its origins to a sketch that he drew for his high school science teacher in 1922.
When we're talking about Farnsworth, there is a lot of known facts. When we're talking about T. Townsend Brown, it gets a little bit more challenging.
You'll see his work in air filters that the sharper image sold, or if you go out to the desert at night, you'll see a bluish haze flying over the desert, and his work is in that. Here is the evidence that we have that Townsend Brown worked for the Naval Research Labs in the 1930s, and I got a letter back that said in its very official language, never heard of the guy, and don't ask again. Implied in the story of Townsend Brown is that he found some way to, if not master gravity, at least to control it and to use it to industrial advantage.
But if it is U.S. tech, and that can be used to explain a lot of this, that all goes straight back to Townsend Brown, potentially, right?
Yes, it does. If you'll indulge me.
Please.
We asked, where does it begin?
Yeah.
And where it all begins for me, where I was drawn into this material, starts in the early 1970s, when I had graduated from college and experimented with the very earliest roving video camera technology, the Sony Portapaks. And the publication that those of us who were doing the very early stages of public access cable TV in the early 70s, we all subscribed to a magazine called Radical Software, which expressed the philosophy of using video for community organization and not just broadcasting commercials. And there was an edition of Radical Software that was published in the summer of 1973 that was published out of San Francisco. And it was called the Video City Edition because I learned in its pages that television was invented in San Francisco in 1927 by Philo T. Farnsworth, who produced in San Francisco in 1927 the first totally electronic camera tubes based on an idea that he had had as a teenager 6 years earlier in 1921. And what surprised me was that I knew none of this, that we were talking about the dominant communications technology, but there was no history of its origin. And then I discovered this material and it fascinated me. But I didn't think too much of it until later that same summer when I was visiting somebody who operated the public access channel on cable in Santa Cruz, California. We'll just call him Johnny. And Johnny was friends with a man named Phil Geetson, who had edited that Video City edition of Radical Software out of San Francisco. And Geetson knew Philo T. Farnsworth III, who was the oldest son, born in 1929, of Philo T. Farnsworth II, who had invented television. So we're sitting on this hillside in Santa Cruz, swapping stories, and Johnny starts telling me this apocryphal story that he had heard from Phil Geetson, that Phil Geetson had heard from Philo III. And he introduces me first to this concept of nuclear fusion. Now, this is during the period of the 1970s when the nuclear power that had been introduced in the 1950s was beginning to come under some criticism for the waste that it generated and the radiation and so forth. And it was not long after that the movie The China Syndrome came out. So nuclear energy is kind of on the surface of consciousness, and then Johnny introduces me to this concept of fusion, which is the opposite of fission, where instead of splitting atoms, you're causing atoms to fuse together. He explains to me that because the atom that you wind up with after combining two lighter atoms has less mass, than the two atoms that you started out with, that difference is given off according to Einstein's formula, E equals mc squared. So he explains to me the promise of nuclear fusion, that if it can be controlled, that we have the potential for a relatively clean, comparatively safe, but virtually inexhaustible source of industrial energy for combining nuclear fusion reactions. The trick is, a fusion reaction is a star. When you look into the night sky and see all those stars in the night sky, those are all deep space fusion reactors. So the question becomes, how do you bottle a star? What kind of, this is all, I'm hearing all this for the first time on this hillside in Santa Cruz. What kind of container can you build where either the heat of the star doesn't destroy the container or the container doesn't extinguish the star? Well, that's an interesting riddle. That got my imagination. Then he tells me the apocryphal story of the work that Philo T. Farnsworth did in the last 2 decades of his life. He developed a nuclear fusion process. And so this is the man who had, in fact, invented television, taking all the things that he learned over the course of 10 or 15 years perfecting television. He now has as much knowledge of the quantum realm as anybody that gathered at Los Alamos, and he takes that knowledge to try to develop controlled nuclear fusion. And the story that I heard, the apocryphal story, was, imagine a laboratory, a small laboratory, and there's a man inside operating a seemingly complex but very futuristic-looking machine. And just outside the door to this laboratory, his son, maybe a young son or a teenager, is watching his father work. And his father proceeds to produce the impossible star in a jar. And he witnesses all this happening. And after his father has seen to his satisfaction that this thing that he has built is capable of controlling the fusion reaction and bottling the star, he dismantles it and takes a piece out of it and puts it on a high shelf where nobody will ever find it. That's the story that I heard in the summer of 1973, the consequence of which is that you and I are standing here together talking, because that settled in my mind in a way that never went away. And a couple of years later, I was working with somebody in Hollywood, and we came up with the idea of doing a movie for television about the boy who invented it. And that's when I first tracked down the Farnsworth family and met them in Salt Lake City in 1975. So that's my point of origin. But what we're talking about when we look at Einstein's work in 1905 as the point of origin is that everything that we're talking about kind of begins with the photoelectric effect, which was the first paper that Einstein released in 1905, which is considered one of the cornerstones of quantum mechanics.
And that was the one that eventually won him the
You
Nobel.
and I have already played the quiz game. Where I will ask people, do you know what Einstein won his Nobel Prize for? He was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1923, and most people will say either relativity or E equals mc squared.
Right.
But in fact, he won his Nobel Prize for the work that he did to articulate and quantify the photoelectric effect.
Right. And the photoelectric effect again is can you explain that just briefly one more time?
In the very simplest of terms, it is the process by which light becomes electricity.
Right.
Because the part light, he also in that paper defines light as part particle and part wave. So you can see the particles of light striking certain materials like selenium or cesium, and that causes a disturbance in the electron orbits of those atoms that causes electrons to spin out, and from that you can create an electrical current.
And you've got Farnsworth as a 14, 15-year-old who just starts reading all of Einstein's stuff and just becomes obsessed with it, similar to how you became obsessed in the 70s.
I guess, I guess there's a continuum there. It's nice to think about.
Right. Yep, exactly. And so he discovered what. So talk a little bit about his. I mean, to do that and to see that and to understand it at 14, and then as we talked about last night, to begin to start to teach your high school classmates and your teachers about this stuff. And then to have the idea for the television in the first place is just as a teenager, right? I mean, that's insane. It's crazy.
Farnsworth grew up in a very hard-scrabble environment, farming in Idaho and Utah. His father did trail work, packing wagons over the mountains and stuff. And their only exposure, really, to the modern world was through the Sears Roebuck catalog, which was known at the time as the Wish Book, where people that lived in rural areas like that could see what was available to the people who were living in the cities. And that's where he first learned about, I guess, radio and phonographs and the technology that was beginning to emerge at the beginning of the 20th century. And through whatever other reading he had access to, he learned about the men who created those things, like Edison and Bell and maybe Tesla. And at a very early age, he confided in his father his wish that he had been born an inventor. And just the way he puts it, I think, acknowledges that it's a stroke of destiny. It's not something you don't decide to be an inventor, but you realize that that's something you might have the capacity to do. And so he expresses at an early age his desire to be an inventor, and then somewhere, the family moved from Utah to Rigby, Idaho in, I think, the summer of 1918, just as World War I was ending. And there's a scene in the book where the wagons come over the crest of a hill to see their new property that they're moving to, which was owned by his father's brother, his uncle. And young Philo, the first thing he sees are wires stretched between the buildings on the grounds. And he says, "This place has electricity." This will be his first personal exposure to electricity at about age 11. And so he finds that they have a Delco generator, and they are using electricity on this homestead. And in the attic of one of the buildings, he finds a little trove of magazines about science and invention. In fact, there was a magazine called Science and Invention, published by Hugo Gernsback, one of the deans of early science fiction. The Hugo Awards that are awarded for science fiction writing, they're named after Hugo Gernsback. So in one of those magazines, he encounters the concept of television. Because we're now into the second decade of the 20th century. We have radio and we have motion pictures. And so the world is rife with speculation that someday we'll find a way to merge those technologies and have moving pictures that fly through the air like sound does. And basically, he decides, Philo T. Farnsworth, age 13, 14, decides if he wants to launch a career as an inventor, television would be a good thing to invent. And so he begins studying the field. And what he discovers is that at the time, the kinds of technology that was being employed to achieve that purpose was literally a merger of motion picture technology with radio. It was very mechanical, and it used spinning discs with a spiral of perforations to trace across. There you go. That's the idea. You have to trace a small line of a segment of the image and then have the light from that hit a photocell to produce an electrical stream. So the task is to break the image down into its component parts. But at a very young age, again, having been born into a world that had never not known relativity and quantum mechanics, which he had started also studying at a young age, he knew that those machines were never going to go fast enough to produce a coherent image. So he starts looking for a solution in the theories of Einstein. And right there in the photoelectric effect, he finds it. And so over the course of some period of time, he discovers the photoelectric effect. He discovers that electrons can be manipulated magnetically in a vacuum tube, a cathode ray tube. And he discovers the cathode ray tube. And there was speculation at the time that cathode ray tubes might be a suitable device for producing a television picture. But he lets those gestate for a while. And then the story is that one hot summer afternoon in probably July of 1921, he's festering over all these things as he's plowing a field. And we don't know if it was a potato field. We assume potatoes because we're talking about Idaho, but the family thinks it was a sugar beet field. But at the end of, he's on a disc harrow, which is a device drawn by a horse that has wheels in it that are tilling the soil, in effect. And he reaches at the end of one of these rows that he has plowed. He turns around to survey his work, and he sees the parallel furrows in the soil. And in that moment, he has the inspiration that he can scan an image one line at a time with a magnetically deflected beam of electrons in a cathode ray tube. So that, to inventors, is the moment that television was invented, because that's when he had the concept. But it was another 6 years.
Can you dive into that just really quickly? So it can double click on that and just explain what that means to scan an image line by line.
Well, it's harder to see in the kinds of LED and OLED TVs that we have today. But if you go back and look at a vacuum tube, cathode ray tube receiver from even the 1990s, if you look closely, you'll see that there are individual lines in the image. So the image isn't there intact. It is produced on the screen by a beam of electrons that is beaming a fluctuating current at a phosphorescent screen one line at a time. So it traces one line, it jumps back, traces another line, jumps back, traces another line. Does this so fast that the eye can't see that there's anything happening other than the motion on the screen. That's persistence of motion, the same principle that makes motion pictures work. The retina retains an image for long enough that it's still there when the next image is imprinted on the retina, and so it creates the illusion of motion in the eye and the brain. So in motion pictures, that's done in one full frame at a time, 24 frames a second. But in order to do it in television or video, you need to break each frame down into some kind of component image. And that's done a line at a time. So you scan a line, you scan another line, you scan another line. 500 in the original television sets, it was 525 lines over 30 frames a second. So we're bouncing this electron beam back and forth in the vacuum tube. I think that adds up to 17-something thousand times a second that we're manipulating this electron beam. And those are all the ideas that first occurred to him that summer afternoon in Rigby, Idaho in 1921. He saw how that could be done. The measure of how far advanced that was, remember, we're in a very competitive electronics environment now. Radio is popular, phonographs are popular, there are whole companies and industries that are built around this, and it's clear that television will come down the pike at some point. So there's competition to find the best way to do this. And he kept that idea in his head for 6 years before somebody volunteered the funding to start building what he had seen only in his mind's eye. And he expected that an entire 6 years, he would pick up a magazine someday and see that somebody else had come up with his idea. Never happened. That's how far ahead he was, that when he finally had the opportunity in 1926 and delivered the device in 1927, still nobody had come up with the same idea. So we'll just fast forward to September 7th, 1927. He's been in a laboratory in San Francisco for a year with money from a group of what we would now call angel investors, associated mostly with the Crocker Bank in San Francisco. They've given him a $25,000 seed fund. He basically spends about twice that over the course of the year. But on September 7th, 1927, he fires up a camera tube that he's built and a receiver tube that he's built. And his brother-in-law, Cliff Gardner, who is actually the glass blower, drops a glass slide that has only a simple straight line painted across it, drops it in front of the camera in front of incredibly bright light. And Phil and Pam, his wife, and some other colleagues are in the next room, and they can see the thing jump when Cliff drops the slide in front of the camera tube. That's one of the later image dissectors. And Phil says, rotate the slide, Cliff. And when Cliff rotates the slide, they can see the line go from horizontal to vertical. And that's all they needed to know that intelligence, information, had been transferred from the bottom of one empty bottle to the bottom of another. And that's the moment when video arrives on the planet.
Wow. Incredible.
Yeah.
So maybe, I mean, all video maybe kind of stems from that moment. Our phones, our television, our movies,
Everything.
everything.
And I'm fond of saying, and would love to debate this with anybody who cares to say otherwise, that every video screen that we have on the planet, the most dominant technology that we have today, every video screen on the planet can trace its origins to a sketch that he drew for his high school science teacher in 1922. And we have that sketch because during patent litigation in the 1930s, the attorneys went out to Salt Lake City and found the teacher that he had drawn that sketch for, and he still had it.
This is the sketch.
That is the sketch. Every video screen on the planet can trace its origins to that sketch.
And when you say patent litigation, was it RCA?
That was RCA.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what, just real quick, what was happening there?
Well, the Radio Corporation of America basically controlled all of the radio technology in the country, if not the world. And that was in part because of an agreement that was reached in the 1920s between all the giant electrical companies, principally General Electric, RCA, AT&T, and Westinghouse. And the agreement was they basically divided the realm between the four of them. And the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, which had been spun off from the Navy after it had appropriated Marconi's patents during World War I in order to maintain domestic control of radio and wireless technology. The Radio Corporation was formed out of that and then was basically provided all those patents. They controlled all those patents and essentially controlled radio. AT&T was sort of granted by virtue of this consent decree in 1926. AT&T got all the wired communications. RCA got the wireless communications. And General Electric and Westinghouse got the generating business, the electrical generating and distributing business. So by the time we get to the late 1920s, when it's clear that television is going at some point to displace radio, RCA begins to take an interest in it. And there is an individual named David Sarnoff, who now at this time is the general manager and basically running the show at RCA. And he is determined at some point that he will become remembered as the father of television, the man who brought television to the world. And to that end, he learns of an engineer at Westinghouse whose name is Vladimir Zworykin. Zworykin came to the United States in 1921 from Russia, where he had studied with a man named Boris Rosing, who was one of the two people who postulated using cathode ray tubes for television before Farnsworth actually made it happen. And so he brought Rosing's ideas to the United States and experimented with them at Westinghouse and applied for a patent for an electronic television system in 1923. And that becomes an important date because that's what you will run into when you're searching this record. But the record seems to show that even though he tried to build some tubes for Westinghouse between 1923 and 25, they did not work. And nevertheless, Sarnoff hires Zworykin to work for him at RCA in around 1929 or 30. And this is where the story veers off into industrial espionage. Farnsworth produces his first picture in 1927 and begins getting some press coverage for it in 1928. And so Sarnoff may have learned of the existence of a fully electronic television system through an article that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle in 1928. That's when he decides to bring Zworykin in so that he can try to develop a system of his own at RCA. But Zworykin is still working for Westinghouse. And what Farnsworth needs in order to advance his businesses is licenses for his patents that will pay royalties for the use of those patents. That's the business model that he envisioned from the start. He wanted to be like Edison, and he didn't want to have to manufacture things. He just wanted to invent things, license them, and then use that money to go on and invent something else.
Sure.
So the Farnsworth team is approached by somebody at Westinghouse with the offer of a license or the premise of a license. If their engineer, Zworykin, can come to San Francisco to evaluate Farnsworth's work. So in April of 1930, Vladimir Zworykin spends 3 days at Philo Farnsworth's laboratory and is shown basically everything. They're very open about it all because they think this is going to lead to a patent license. And in fact, they had come up with a very novel technique of sealing a flat plate of glass at the end of the cylinder of the tube. Before that, vacuum tubes all had a domed end. And now Cliff Gardner devised a way in a glass lathe of sealing optical glass into the end of the cylinder of glass. And he showed that to Zworykin, and this is one of my favorite moments in the whole story. Zworykin sees the tube that they fabricated and says, well, my people told me this couldn't be done. And Cliff said, well, we didn't know it couldn't be done, so we just went ahead and did it.
Perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that was the spirit that infused that laboratory in San Francisco in the 1920s. And when Zworykin is handed the finished image dissector, the camera tube that they've developed, he holds it in his hand and he speaks out loud. Everybody heard him say, this is a beautiful instrument. I wish I'd invented it. And he leaves Farnsworth's laboratory. He sends a 300-word telegram to his team in Pittsburgh. They fabricate an image dissector tube. He takes the train back to Pittsburgh. He picks up this new image dissector tube and takes it with him to the RCA labs in Camden. And now he has a fully electronic television system to work with. And the camera is the key to all this. You can't get a high-resolution image unless you have a device that's capable of producing the high-resolution signal. That is the breakthrough that the Farnsworth's image dissector represented. So he can begin developing electronics because he's got this tube. And I said that when he was handed the finished image dissector tube in Farnsworth's lab in 1930 and said, this is a beautiful instrument, I wish I had invented it. 4 years later, in 1934, RCA made the claim that he had. Mm-hmm. And now we're engaged in patent litigation between Farnsworth and RCA that went on for about 5 or 6 years.
Well, until the moment where the high school teacher was able to produce the image.
During the litigation, the pivotal litigation was a case, the docket number was 64027. The case was heard in 1934 and the decision was rendered in 1935. And during the hearings of that, Farnsworth's attorneys made the assertion that he had had this idea when he was a teenager. And RCA's attorneys scoffed at that and said, no teenager can come up with an idea as bold as this. And so they decided to go to Salt Lake City to see if they could find his teacher. His name was Justin Tolman. And the lawyers approached him. They found him in his rose garden in Salt Lake City and asked him if he remembered a student named Philo T. Farnsworth. And he said, oh, very well. He was the smartest student I ever had. And asked if he had ever said anything about his television system. And he said, oh, yes, I have a sketch that he drew for me. And they said, stop, don't say any more. We got to get you into the deposition. So the next day, they brought Justin Tolman into the deposition, and he did produce into evidence the drawing that Philo Farnsworth had drawn for him sometime in the late winter or early spring of 1922. He had originally sketched it on the chalkboard. And when Tolman came into the room, he said, what's all this? And Philo said, well, this is my idea for electronic television. And Tolman said, television? What's that? And he proceeded to explain what television was and how this thing that he had drawn would produce it. And later in the conversation, or later over other conversations that I had, he drew one on a piece of paper and said, this might be valuable someday, hold on to this. And he did. And when it became valuable, he was able to produce it in the patent litigation. Yeah. Now, that drawing was not pivotal in the litigation, because the patent examiners ruled that because Tolman himself was not an expert in the field, it didn't weigh substantially on the evidence that was being considered, because they're looking for expert testimony. It's a great part of the story, but it has no bearing on the outcome of the case. The outcome of the case was determined entirely on Zworykin's inability to make a case that he had an operable camera tube in 1923. And the patent examiners just shattered Zworykin's case. Yeah.
So if that interaction had never happened with the teacher, then today everyone in the world still believes that RCA invented the television, right?
No, what I'm saying is that piece of evidence was not pivotal in the decision. So, but if that piece of paper, if the thing that had been drawn on that piece of paper didn't exist, we might still be listening to radio.
Got it. Okay.
Or as I said to somebody on one occasion recently, if you took all of Farnsworth's patents out of television, you would be left with a radio.
Okay, and so it's incredible story. And so, with the ruling of the case being towards Farnsworth's favor, then what does that change? What does that change for history?
It oddly becomes a kind of a footnote because of the way the rest of the story unfolds over the following decades. RCA's business model was predicated on the idea that the radio corporation doesn't pay patent royalties, the radio corporation collects patent royalties. And there's a whole history of incidents where RCA wanted a technology, and so they either put the company out of business in competition or they acquired the rights. Farnsworth was the exception. He was not willing to sell. So that's why they needed to go into litigation to try to assume the rights to the patents through a legal process. But that failed on every count. So in 1939, Sarnoff has spent so much money on television that his board of directors is beginning to breathe down his neck for results. And that is when Sarnoff decides that he's going to launch television at the New York World's Fair in 1939. And that is falsely remembered as the launch of commercial television in the United States. And I say falsely because nobody had permission from the FCC to actually sell commercial time until 1941. And by that time, the standards changed altogether. So what Sarnoff did in 1939 at the World's Fair was basically raise the sun on television's false dawn that lasted until the end of World War II, basically. But Sarnoff was determined that he would be remembered as the man who delivered television to the world. And so he set this event up at the World's Fair in 1939 and said, and now we add sight to sound. And that's kind of what is remembered as the beginning of television. But at the same time, his patent attorneys were engaged in intense negotiations with the Farnsworth team for the use of his patents. And later that year, in September of 1939, RCA capitulated and accepted a license from Farnsworth Television and Radio for the use of Farnsworth's seminal video patents. It was the first time in RCA's history that they ever agreed to pay a royalty for the use of another inventor's patents. So, and there's other details in this story that all evolved during the 1930s. The technology was evolving very rapidly. And when, in fact, we get into the 1940s and television begins to take off in the wake of World War II, there are new iterations of these camera tubes, and they are all traceable back to Farnsworth's patents. But by 1939 and 40, Farnsworth was pretty much exhausted. And when people ask me, why have we never heard of Farnsworth, I'll say there are three reasons, essentially. First was he was always a forward-looking individual, so he was not inclined to dwell on his past achievements. He knew he had invented television. He didn't have anything to prove to the world what was next. The second is, as we've already discussed, there were pretenders to that throne. If you go to Britain, they'll tell you a man named John Logie Baird invented television. That was a mechanical system. And here in the United States, of course, we had Zworykin and others. But the real reason we don't know of Farnsworth is because he was not survived by his own company that could promote his legacy. He did have a company that was formed in 1938, Farnsworth Television and Radio. He never wanted to have a manufacturing facility, but that was what his investors decided to set up to support his continuing work. So he went along with it, and they acquired a phonograph company, the Capehart Company in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then developed its operations to produce first radios with the expectation that they would produce televisions. In the 1940s, or once television was launched, Farnsworth retreated at that point. He went to live on a farm in Maine. He sat out World War II on that farm in Maine. He milled wood from his woods to make boxes for bullets, and he was thinking. That's when he started thinking about things like nuclear fusion. And long story short, the company did very well during the war. They took on a lot of debt. They faltered after the war. They defaulted on the debt. And rather than declare bankruptcy, in 1949, the Farnsworth Television and Radio Company was acquired by the International Telephone and Telegraph Company, ITT. And he became an employee of ITT for the rest of his life. So that's why the name is not more familiar. It should be, because it was one of the seminal moments, I think, in human evolution when we manifest the miracle of being able to see at a distance, as we do all the time now.
What was the first video or image that was broadcasted on television?
From 1927 until, I'm going to say, about 1931, Farnsworth Laboratories were the only place that had a fully electronic television system. In 1931, he did get a license from the Philco company. Now, some people will hear Philo and think Philco. Philco was the Philadelphia Storage Battery Company, and they made very popular radios in the 1930s, but they knew that television was coming. They wanted to get into the television business, and they heard about Farnsworth, and they offered him a license for his patents if he would move his operations from San Francisco to the Philco plant in Philadelphia. So that's why I say laboratories. The first image that he produced was, as I was saying earlier, simply a straight line painted on a plate of glass.
Right.
And that was enough to see that intelligence was being transmitted from the bottom of one bottle to the bottom of another. The first time they see real motion, they're working with just solid objects for the first however many months. The first time they see real motion is when Phil is in the receiver room and Cliff is in the camera room. And Phil, he called himself Phil at this point. He dropped the O from his name. So Phil sees on the receiver what looks like smoke. And he thinks, oh my God, the system's on fire. And then he realizes, and then Cliff's hand drifts into the frame and he sees that he's seeing the smoke from Cliff's cigarette. So they had already improved the system well enough that you could begin to see the fine surfaces of a ray of smoke coming off a cigarette.
No sound at this point. Right?
They're not worried about sound at this point. That's almost an afterthought.
Right.
As in fact, sound was when they started manufacturing televisions.
That's the easy
with
part.
tiny little speakers. So, and I don't know if we'll have time for it, but there's a marvelous story, too, about a man named Edwin H. Armstrong, who invented FM. And when they began broadcasting television in the 1940s, they used Armstrong's frequency modulation for the audio signal so that it would be free of static.
Okay.
I'll come back for another episode and we'll talk about Armstrong.
Deal. Sounds
Because we
good.
haven't even gotten to Townsend Brown yet.
I know.
We've been at this for a minute.
I know.
So, it was difficult to shoot on camera live images because the amount of light that they needed for the photoelectric surfaces, which were insensitive, was just ridiculous. But his wife, Alma Gardner, known as Pem, she was the first woman to ever appear on electronic television. We have some photographs of her on the screen.
Okay.
That's a studio that they built in the 1930s to demonstrate how television would actually work in the practical world.
Okay.
But when we're done, we can go back and I'll find you the pictures I think that we have of Pem. And then where they really began to make big advancements was starting in about 1929. They developed the first film chain, which is the device that converts motion pictures to video. And somebody got their hands on a motion picture projector and they connected it to an image dissector. Now they could pour all the light they needed into the camera because it wasn't going to hurt anybody to stand in front of the light. And they started experimenting with film loops, one of which was Walt Disney's Steamboat Willie. And another one they used the most was a film of, I think, Mary Pickford combing her hair. Maybe it was The Taming of the Shrew. And they could see that the picture was getting better and better as they could see more and more of the details in Mary Pickford's hair. Yeah. There's one other detail in the Farnsworth story that surfaced years later that reinforces this idea that he was on to something that he withheld. The Farnsworth archives were stored in a garage in Fort Wayne, Indiana for many years and were transferred to California around 2020, just before 2019, just before the pandemic. And we went out there, me and a couple of colleagues that are interested in fusion, went out there to look at the files. And we're very surprised to find in those files a journal we had never seen before. And it's just marked confidential notes on the front. And when we opened it, we discovered that there was nothing in it except 6 or 7 pages had been torn out. And on the one page that remained, Ryan, can you pull it up for me to read? Pam Farnsworth has written in her hand the last ideas he considered too confidential to leave a record of. He felt the world of humanity was not ready for his last gift and maybe not worthy of it. So we're talking here about a man that had a very spiritual foundation. And I'll ask Ryan now to pull up that quote from the... This is something that Farnsworth said late in his life that I think provides some really useful insight into the conversation we're having about what he may or may not have accomplished in the realm of nuclear fusion. He said, "I know that God exists. I know I never invented anything. I've been a medium by which these things were given to the culture as fast as the culture could earn them. I give all the credit to God."
Who's God?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah, it's easy to talk like that,
Yeah.
but what's he talking about? Like, who's God for him, I guess?
I think God for him is the intelligence buried in the quantum continuum.
Yeah.
And I think it spoke to him.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
The Townsend Brown book begins with a quotation from the writer Elizabeth Gilbert, and I can't remember which book it's taken from, but she says, "There is a supreme intelligence in the universe that longs to communicate with us." And I think we're up against the threshold where that intelligence doesn't feel like it can share anymore with us because we haven't grown into what we already have. So...
Interesting. So why is this story of Farnsworth so inseparable from the Townsend Brown story? Like, why is it difficult to tell the Townsend Brown story without the Farnsworth story?
I think we'll save for later in the conversation where the two, I think, come together after we've talked about Brown a little bit.
Okay.
But that becomes a personal story for me because it was that afternoon on the Hill in 1973 when I heard about Farnsworth's fusion work that I became intrigued with the story. And even though I met the family in 1975, they were always very circumspect about that side of the story. And I didn't hear critical details in that story for another 15 years, to tell you the truth. But that was the hook for me. And I wrote a treatment for the movie that we hoped to make in 1977. I wrote that treatment in 1977. And then in the year 2000, I had a turn in my own career and I met somebody who was a publisher and I showed him that material and he asked if I'd want to make a book out of it. So that became the first iteration of The Boy Who Invented Television. And as I'm finishing that book at a kind of a gap in my career, I'm thinking, oh boy, now I'm a biographer of obscure 20th century scientists. What will I do next? I had no idea. And
you'd not heard of Townsend Brown.
I had not heard of Townsend Brown
right.
until one night in I think July of 2002. The book was published in September 2002. I'm looking at the galleys. It was very exciting because I had galleys of this material that I'd had for 25 years. And I get an email out of the blue, and I think it was titled Townsend Brown. And I've never seen this name before. Or it says Overlooked Inventors. And it says, look up Townsend Brown. He is another overlooked inventor. His work was disputed by physics. Physics said it was impossible, but they classified it anyway. And if you'll see his work in air filters that the Sharper Image sold, Or if you go out to the desert at night, you'll see a bluish haze flying over the desert, and his work is in that. And if maybe we go back and look at the letter, and I can read it for you because I still have, there's a graphic of the letter somewhere. But I got this letter out of the blue that said, look up Townsend Brown. And I did.
They're talking about UAP phenomenon in the,
right. Against my better judgment, I went down the rabbit hole.
Do you regret it?
There have been times, yes, when I have. I don't regret it right now because since I've gone ahead and published the book, it's opened up a lot of avenues for me. I get to sit with a guy like you and talk about all this stuff and generate interest around these phenomenal stories with a wider audience. So I don't regret it in that sense. But particularly with the Townsend Brown story, which is so twisted and convoluted and hidden that there were times when I really questioned whether or not I'd ever get to the end of it. And in fact, I reached a point of frustration with that material in 2009 where I just put it away. I said, I can't finish this. And needless to say, that caused some Sturm und Drang in some circles. But then when I came to another turning point in my life at the beginning of 2002, I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll go back to that. And I did, and here we are.
In 2022?
2022, yeah.
And so in the circles that it caused some angst when you walked away from it, I mean, you had been working with Linda, his daughter, for 6 years or so.
When I first learned of Townsend Brown through this anonymous email that I still don't really know who sent it to me, and was looking for somebody to do another biography about, through a couple of connections over the web, I was introduced to Townsend Brown's daughter, Linda Brown. She was living kind of in seclusion in the high desert in Southern California at the time. And we struck up first a correspondence in an antiquated medium called snail mail. We wrote letters to each other. I, of course, typed them on my computer and printed them and sent them. Linda wrote them by hand. And so we struck up this snail mail correspondence. And I sent her, now I had the Farnsworth book in hand, and I sent her a copy of that. And she thought that was sufficiently persuasive that she agreed to collaborate with me on a biography about her father, and expressed her own reluctance to get into the story because there were so many sore points in the story for her. A bitter pill was how she described aspects.
And why was that?
Because it seemed like her father was working on practical inventions that were going to find their way into the marketplace and secure their fortune, but for some reason they always fizzled out. And he was not present for large parts of her life. They moved around a lot under mysterious circumstances that were never fully explained. And it was just a source of frustration for her that she did not know more about what her father had been involved in.
She's alive today?
She's still living, still in the wind, as we say.
She's got to be 90s?
She would be, I believe, 80 this year.
80 this
year. She was born
okay.
She'll be 80 in December.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you were working with her, she was in her 50s, 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So where does it begin? Let's do you need a break first, I guess?
Yeah, I think this would be a good time to take a break. We're about to go into the next long segment.
This is going to be intense.
Okay.
We'll take a quick one.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. When we're talking about Farnsworth, there is a lot of known facts and known data and history there. When we're talking about T. Townsend Brown, it gets a little bit more challenging because there's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of they pulled the curtain when he started to work for the United States government.
That's right.
So
and when you pull the curtain open and peer in, it's still black.
Right. As you have found out as you attempted to research this.
Yeah.
And that's got to be a little bit frustrating. Is that the word for it, or?
We'll use frustrating.
Yeah.
There are other adjectives that come to mind that went through my mind over the course of the years that I've worked on it.
Right. But where does his story start? Where
does his story start?
Yeah.
So Townsend Brown was born in 1905, the same year that Einstein released his seminal papers, to a very affluent family in Muskingum County, Ohio. Zanesville, Ohio, to be precise. And his family had built their fortune in the quarry and construction businesses. They built a lot of the public buildings in Muskingum County and Zanesville. So they lived a very affluent life, and at a very early age, he showed the same kind of natural capacity for all things electrical that Philo Farnsworth had begun to demonstrate when he had access to electricity at age 11. Townsend Brown would have had access at a much younger age because of his family's means. He was building radios at a very young age. There was a story published in one of the newspapers about Townsend Brown, maybe 10 years old, has built a wireless set. And he had a fascination, I think, with the possibilities of space travel and of advanced communications as well. So that was kind of what was lurking in the back of his mind. Where his story starts to take its turn is at Caltech in 1923 or thereabouts. He was frustrated with the experimental environment there because often he would build an experiment and then have to take it down at the end of class, so there was no continuity for him. But there was one event in particular which became seminal to his experience, and that was when they were experimenting with a Coolidge tube, which was one of the earliest forms of an X-ray tube. And the Coolidge tube operated on a very high voltage. And what he noticed when they turned the tube on and they applied the high voltage to the Coolidge tube, he caught out of the corner of his eye that the cable that was supplying the voltage seemed to jump or snap at the instant that the voltage was applied. He was more curious about what was going on there than the fact that the tube could generate X-rays. And that was the path that he followed. And a little later, he conduct some experiments with the tube itself. Any vacuum tube like a Coolidge tube is going to have a cathode and an anode. That's a negatively charged plate and a positively charged plate. I don't know what the motivation for this particular experiment was, but he created an experiment where he harnessed the tube itself in a harness rather than fixed in a chassis. He suspended it in a harness, and when the tube was powered up, he noticed that it would swing in the harness. So that became the focal point of his curiosity going forward. What was causing that seeming thrust from the application of voltage to this Coolidge tube?
Right, yeah. Right. And how much was he applying? I mean, how much of a charge was he applying to the Coolidge tube that caused it?
It's in the kilovolt range. I don't know if it's 10 kilovolts, 20 kilovolts, but somewhere in the low kilovolt range.
He was creating, so he thought that he was creating motion.
He thought that something was causing thrust, yes. And that becomes the source of his experiments.
Right. And to his dying day, he thought that he was creating, that he had created thrust. And that's kind of where the story gets controversial, I guess.
Exactly. It gets controversial starting around, 1942. So I'll walk you up to 1942.
Good.
He believes he has made a discovery, and he begins couching it in the terms of gravitation. That he has found a way. In fact, there's an article that's printed in 1929 in Popular Science under the title of How I Control Gravitation. And he begins to get a kind of a local reputation as this whiz kid who had somehow mastered gravity.
Right.
And
so there's four forces that exist today, right? That you've got electromagnetism, gravity, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, and we've mastered electromagnetism. We have, and it's everywhere. It's in every piece of equipment that we have. We've mastered it. Then the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, we've probably, I guess, fair to say, maybe we've partially mastered.
There's a missing fourth there too, but we'll come back to that at the end of the conversation.
Yeah. And then gravity, of course, there's nothing. We can do nothing with gravity except exist within it. We can't. We're just hopeless and helpless to its forces. And so that's kind of the interesting thing. Like, are we really, or did T. Townsend Brown actually figure out via this negatively charged plate, positively charged plate, that you can create a thrust and make gravity essentially negligible? Yeah.
Well, as you said, when we started talking about Townsend Brown just now, we're into a realm of speculation,
right,
and a lot of controversy, and it becomes very difficult to get to the cold hard facts of it. So he was at MIT. He was frustrated with the environment at MIT. He goes to Denison University in Granville, Ohio, and he begins studying with a man there named Paul Alfred Biefeld. And Biefeld had been a student at the University of Zurich during the time when Einstein was there. Some accounts will say that they were classmates. Biefeld himself said once that he helped Einstein organize his notes. I don't know if any of that is true or not, but we try to draw a connection, one of those red strings on the crime board to Einstein that way. I don't know if it's valid or not. But he was a contemporary of Einstein's. And Townsend Brown and Biefeld got into conversations about this force that he had observed and whether or not it might be some evidence of a way of manipulating gravity, controlling gravity, producing artificial gravity. And the story is that Townsend asked Biefeld what instrumentality might produce this effect, what device. And that's when Biefeld thought about it for a second and said, a capacitor. So that's why when you're talking about Townsend Brown, you're talking about capacitors.
And it's really the marrying of electromagnetism with gravity, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So in the latter years of his life, Einstein was looking for the unified field. Now, for most of his life, we were only dealing with the two fundamental interactions, electromagnetism and gravity. The practical knowledge of nuclear energy, even though it was suggested in E equals mc squared, the practical application of the weak force and the strong force doesn't begin to emerge until sometime in the 1930s. And so when Einstein was trying to develop his unified field theory, he was looking for a theoretical link between electricity and gravitation, electromagnetism and gravity. And long story short, even while the theory was still speculative, Townsend Brown made the leap to thinking that he had found the physical manifestation in what Paul Biefeld recommended as a capacitor, that somehow that combination of capacitance and high voltage produced a thrust which was some kind of gravitational force.
Okay, so and by that you mean in a capacitor, you've got a positively charged plate and a negatively charged plate.
Right.
And when you hit them with a high enough voltage, the positively charged plate, which is larger than the negatively charged plate, begins to chase the negatively charged plate.
That's the phenomenon in a nutshell.
Okay.
If you took a positively charged plate and a negatively charged plate in space and charged them, their natural reaction would be to simply come together, right?
Right.
Because they're opposite charges. So what you do in a capacitor is you space them apart with a substance called a dielectric. And there are scales of dielectric capacitance, the ability to store the charge in that dielectric material. So the plates of the capacitor are separated. And the phenomenon that Townsend Brown observes and is working on is what he observes is when charged to a high voltage, something beginning at least 10 kilovolts, but preferably getting into the megavolts, he observes that the positive plate seems to chase the negative plate, and that is the observed motion that becomes known as the Biefeld-Brown effect.
And so in a vacuum or anywhere, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you're in a vacuum. It doesn't, this occurs, I mean, theoretically, this occurs anywhere. Is that right?
This is where I have to confess for anybody tuned in that I'm not a physicist, but I do play one on podcasts.
Yeah, perfect. No, and that's a part of the issue with the whole, I mean, with Townsend Brown and this whole situation is that it's all classified, like, and the work that's been done and the experimental physics that have been done is we don't know about it. Like, and so to get to megavolts, like, what do you need? I mean, can I convert my Tesla charger into something that's going to generate that much electric? Like how can people, can people at an individual or small scale level even harness enough electricity to create that charge to test this theoretically?
You can get to megavolts.
Yeah.
And
not theoretically, but experimentally.
Yeah. So here is where we kind of open one of the mystery doors and we go down another rabbit hole, and we are wondering what sort of phenomena occur in an environment of very high or megavolts and very low currents. And there are a couple of places in the book where, like, for example, Agnew Bonson, who was a colleague of Brown's in the 1950s, says strange things happen in that environment. You look at the work that Tesla did, for example, at Colorado Springs, and I think that was around 1901, around the turn of the century. And what he's observing there are the phenomena that occur in a high voltage environment. A Tesla coil is one way of stepping up voltages into very high voltage ranges.
Also classified.
Well, right. Let's save that rabbit hole for later.
Yeah. That's the next episode.
We're already
as well.
falling, right. And we don't know if there is a bottom to this rabbit hole or if there is even a rabbit.
Right. That's the best kind of rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Just keep falling.
Yeah.
But it does make me think with those two plates, positively charged, negatively charged, of the UAP phenomenon, and you're seeing images of a ship rotating and then taking off, or a saucer would be a perfect plate to a perfect right. shape to have a really big positively charged plate, the exterior, the outside circularity of it, and then the little dome on the top being the negatively charged plate. And I mean, people have seen those things since the 40s, since maybe even the 30s, around the time that he started his work.
Yeah.
People are seeing these things all over the place, flying and crashing, and it would make more sense if they're crashing here and there, if it's some black budget, technology as opposed to an extraterrestrial technology. In a lot of cases, I'm not discounting the phenomenon, but I think thinking about this episode and getting ready for this podcast and just learning more about his work, it could possibly explain a lot of the sightings that have been seen in this country and across the world since the 1930s, possibly, but certainly into the 40s, that it could be possible that this is government tech, that this is United States technology, right. that T. Townsend Brown actually was the originator of this technology.
That is the point of speculation that we seem to be exploring now that Townsend Brown is beginning to get some visibility and profile. Jesse Michaels has done a great podcast about him. We're having these conversations. I've been having these conversations now for about a year. And I try to contain myself within the limits of my own scientific knowledge and what I've learned just over the course of studying these two stories. My angle is more toward the historical aspect. I don't profess to be the degree of scientist as some of the other people who are looking into this stuff. So, I don't want to go overboard in trying to explain things scientifically. But there does seem to be this period from the 1940s into the mid-1950s when a case can be made, as you were saying, that this technology was being actively explored in some dark realm.
Right.
So we'll back up to 1933, when, as a naval officer, he is assigned as the radio operator on a research mission into the Caribbean on a yacht owned by a man named Eldridge Reeves Johnson. And Johnson's is a name that we should also remember, because while we give Edison credit for inventing recording, Eldridge Reeves Johnson invented the recording industry. He came up with the master-slave system of creating an original recording, creating copies of that, which were the slaves, and then making millions of copies from the slaves. That was the way records were made until they started making CDs in the 1980s. And Eldridge Reeves Johnson was the man who produced came up with that approach and built a company called the Victor Talking Machines Company around it, which was the most successful manufacturer of phonographs and radio phonographs in the 1920s. The word Victrola comes from Victor Talking Machines Company, and I don't know who Victor was, okay. but that's Eldridge Reeves Johnson's Genesis origin story.
Eldridge was 20s loaded. He was doing well.
Right. He was 20s loaded. And he had the presence of mind to sell the Victor Talking Machines Company to RCA. So when you see the RCA logo of the terrier tipping his head in front of the big cone loudspeaker that says his master's voice was actually Eldridge Reeves Johnson. But RCA adopted that logo and took it as their own when they acquired the Victor Talking Machines Company, and actually became, going into the 1930s, the RCA Victor Company. And Johnson was paid like $25 to $30 million for his company, which would translate into hundreds of millions. And he took some of that money and built the second largest private yacht in America. It was called the Caroline. It was second only to J.P. Morgan's yacht, the Corsair, in overall length. And there it is. That's the yacht that Townsend Brown was invited to voyage on through the Caribbean in 1933. And when the Caroline stops on its way to the Caribbean in Nassau in the Bahamas, they take a visitor on board for dinner. That man was William S. Stevenson. And there's a story behind how I learn all this stuff, because Linda Brown and I knew nothing. And after a year trying to learn anything, we still knew nothing until a colleague, a classmate of hers who was drawn into whatever network Townsend Brown was part of, which I think traces its origins to the yacht Caroline in 1933, that character showed up and began corresponding with us. I codenamed him Morgan. And Morgan was the one who started referring to this mysterious consortium as the Caroline Group, because Brown became associated with it when he went sailing on the yacht Caroline in 1933. And so
33 to 42, there could have been some weird stuff happening.
So because of the break in 42, and because of things that happened during the 1930s with Brown as a sort of part-time naval officer, I think that there was work being done behind the scenes, but not as classified military research. It was being developed privately with funds that were being provided by the Caroline Group.
Sure. And it was before the war. I mean, there was less of a secrecy probably. There was less needs to classify everything. We didn't have that national security that National Security Act where, everything became dark black budget stuff. I'm sure it was just a different time.
Well, there were security apparatuses put in place during World War I that sort of atrophied after the war. And in their place, the story we're telling goes, some of these private individuals like Eldridge Reeves Johnson and a man in England named William S. Stevenson, who had industrial interests in electronics industries, formed a kind of a loose consortium to keep track of what else was going on around the world. So that at its very basic level is what I think we're referring to as the Caroline Group. And when the Caroline yacht is on its way to the Caribbean and stops overnight in Nassau in the Bahamas, and Nassau plays a peripheral role in the story too, a man comes on board to have dinner, and that man is identified as William S. Stevenson. And for the sake of context, in 1933, we'll fast forward to World War II, when William S. Stevenson is called upon by Winston Churchill to organize Britain's security apparatus for the coming war. So if you've ever heard the expression, a man called intrepid, intrepid was the code name that Churchill gave to his master spy, who is William S. Stevenson. So that's a point of context. That's Stevenson during World War I. And he made some contacts and met people in the British security and intelligence establishment during World War I. So that's how he becomes part of that world. And so we are discussing and speculating that Stevenson and Johnson were kind of industrial allies, and Stevenson comes on board and is introduced to Townsend Brown. And that's when this group becomes interested in Townsend Brown, and he is effectively recruited into what we're calling the Caroline Group because of his advanced knowledge of radio science and because of the interesting ideas that he's harboring.
And yeah, radio science. I guess radio science includes potential propulsion
Well, he had demonstrated propulsion devices based on the ideas that he had talked to Paul Biefeld about prior to that. They are illustrated in that magazine article that was released in 1922 in Popular Science. He has demonstrated a purely electrical means of propulsion. Yeah.
And all of a sudden, there's Foo Fighters showing up everywhere.
Yeah, well, now we're going down door number 4.
Right. Yeah. So what next? So what happens next? And we're still in the 30s, I guess. After this meeting,
I'm going to make these associations. Now, this will be somewhat fresh because I'm going off on a couple of angles here that I've not discussed previously because we're kind of trying to sort out some of these things. So we already talked about having had some facility at the University of Pennsylvania. And actually, Eldridge Reeves Johnson was one of the benefactors of the University of Pennsylvania. And there was a Johnson School of, I think, medicine or radiological medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. There is an episode in 1936 when Townsend Brown is assigned as a lieutenant on a voyage on a vessel called, coincidentally enough, the USS Nashville, coincidentally, just because that's where I live now, Nashville. And while that vessel is in England, it is loaded with something like $36 million worth of gold bullion. And this lowly lieutenant is instrumental in counting each crate as it goes on board. And we don't really know where that money went, but the speculation is that it was used by the Caroline Group to sponsor some of the work that Townsend Brown was doing.
So this is the first time. This is like what the Pentagon's doing today with all the money that just completely disappears. It was actually in the form of gold bullion and just completely disappeared in the exact same way.
It was a very different environment then. We were still on the gold standard, actually, or Roosevelt had just taken us off it, but gold was still a form of currency.
He probably took it off because it all disappeared in this black budget. Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Johnson was very conservatively Republican and opposed Roosevelt, and there's a letter somewhere in the papers where he was very worried about the inflationary impact that Roosevelt's policies were going to have on the economy, particularly taking America off the exchangeable gold standard and then fixing the price at $35 an ounce.
Yeah, eventually everything crashes.
Yeah,
we're not quite yet.
Well, everything had already crashed. Yeah, Roosevelt was trying to resurrect it.
Yeah. Well, eventually the entire system. I mean, it almost happened in 08 with the banking crisis. Right. But I mean, we'll get back there. We'll have another. So, okay. So what next?
So my speculation is that Brown was continuing to develop his work under private auspices, and maybe that story about the bullion is part of that. We don't know for sure, but it's a real story. And I think that work was being done at the University of Pennsylvania, and I think it was an extension of the work that he had done when he was at the Naval Research Labs in the 1930s, developing what appear to be propulsion systems. Let me see if I can get this right, because he actually talks about a three model system. So using the Biefeld-Brown effect, if current is applied to the device, it will be propelled through water. If you propel water through the device, it will generate electricity. And if you propel the device, if you propel water through the device, it will act as a pump. So it was a generator, a means of propulsion, and a pump. That is all documented in correspondence with the Naval Research Labs in the 1930s. And since we're on this note of the story, I will recount my experience of trying to learn what Townsend Brown was doing at the Naval Research Labs in the 1930s. When I met Linda Brown in 2003, she brought with her this one Rubbermaid tub, two Rubbermaid tubs, which was all that she had left of her father's archives. And in those archives, I found letters that he had exchanged with the Naval Research Labs in the 1930s. These letters, some of them bearing Naval Research Labs letterhead. So in 2004, 2005, I filed a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request with the Naval Research Labs, demanding any and all information they had on the service and work of a man named Thomas Townsend Brown at the Naval Research Labs in the 1930s. And after about 6 months, I got a letter back that said that they were unable to find any information about this individual. So, paraphrasing, never heard of the guy.
Yeah, didn't exist.
Right. And that letter ends with saying, if I think that their findings are in error, I can file an appeal. Please provide whatever documentation you have to support your appeal and send it to this address. So I made photocopies of all the letters that I had, and I sent it to that officer and said, here is the evidence that we have that Townsend Brown worked for the Naval Research Labs in the 1930s. Please find whatever additional information that you have and provide it to us. And I got a letter back that said in its very official language, never heard of the guy, and don't ask again.
Wow. Wow.
End of appeal. Don't ask again.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've got the hard evidence here in my hand, and they're saying don't ask again.
Right, right. So what do you think happened there? Like, do you think that came from a higher up? Do you think, like, what's the story?
Well, I've introduced into the story. I mean, this is the part I kind of want to go. Can we go back to talking about Farnsworth? Because I know that story. It's white. It's all on the surface.
Right.
What convolution do you want to fall into in this one?
Right.
I mentioned the character that I codenamed Morgan, who I believe was recruited into whatever organization Stevenson had formed with Eldridge Reeves Johnson, that Townsend Brown became a part of, and then he became part of the national security establishment himself. Morgan used an expression that I think is the answer to the question, what happened? He said Brown's records were sheep-dipped. And that would be an agricultural term by which pests that get into the what do you call the wool of the sheep? To remove it, they just dip the sheep in a vat of some chemical, and those pests are removed. And so that was the expression that was used to describe Townsend Brown's records. They were sheep dipped and gone, dissolved into a vat of acid.
Right. But the don't ask again thing is a little bit daunting, you know.
Well, the official language was, we are unable to find the records that you seek, and this is the end of your appeal. You have appealed, we have denied your appeal, and that's the end of the story. So don't ask again.
And did they say anything to the effect of this is unusual or?
Oh, no, that comes later.
Okay. So what happened next?
That comes.
Well, at least you're persistent.
Yeah, right.
Give you that.
That comes with Linda and I when we are trying to get not the Naval Research Labs, but the standard military records that anybody in the service is entitled to, or their next of kin or family are entitled to. And those are housed in the National Archives, I think in St. Louis. And everybody who has ever served in the military has a file. And Linda requested her father's files, and it didn't take them long to send us a file for the wrong person. It was somebody else named Townsend Brown who had served in the military. And
Thomas Townsend Brown? Or?
It was not Thomas Townsend Brown. It was just Townsend NMI, no middle initial, Brown. Just Townsend Brown. And I'm familiar with that acronym because my father was in the military. He also had no middle initial, and he had to sign all of his military documents, Harvey, NMI Schatzkin. So not having a middle name did not save any ink. So this guy was Townsend, and it was not the droid we were looking for. So Linda persisted, and she finally winds up on the phone with a desk officer at the Naval, the National Archives in St. Louis, and she's trying to find the records. And I don't remember her name now. It's in the book, but this clerk at the National Archives says, "This is very unusual. These records should be here, but we can't find them." And over some period of time, they were able finally to find something. And this woman at the National Archives calls Linda back and says, "We have a file." And then qualifies it and says to Linda, there are she said, this is how she put it. She didn't say that there was anything classified in the record. What she said was, if there was anything classified in the record, that would have had to been removed. And if there was anything in the record that referred to anything classified in the record, that reference would also have to be removed. So it was doubly purged. Then they sent us the file. But you used the word very unusual, and you're right. And even the officer, the desk officer at the National Archives said, yeah, this is very unusual for what should have been perfectly standard records on the military service of Townsend Brown. Yeah.
So, I mean, if there's nothing there, if there's no, if this
why
is just,
hide it?
right. Why erase all of it? Why attempt to classify it and keep it all? Why pretend like the guy never existed? Why? There would be no reason to do that. So obviously he was doing something.
Yeah.
I mean, he was obviously his inventions or whatever work he was working on was something that they didn't want to get out, that they erased intentionally, so that people like us wouldn't be able to talk about it in the future, and so that it could remain classified under this, national security, which this whole National Security Act was actually created within 5 weeks of the Roswell incident. I don't know if you're familiar
I've
with
never
that.
made that association, but you're right. They were both in 1947.
Right.
Yeah.
It was immediately after Roswell, and that act is what allows people still to this day to say national security. Can't talk about it. National security. And it was right after Roswell. Right after, which is not a coincidence. It's just not a coincidence.
And there is some evidence that Townsend Brown was involved in some capacity in some of the operations of the NSA. That comes up later when particularly there's a part of the story where we get into satellite surveillance, the earliest efforts at satellite surveillance. And there is
19 days between the Roswell incident and the signing of the National Security Act. So they scrambled to get it together, is my understanding. So interesting. So I'm sorry I took you off.
I'm just marveling at how you can ask this oracle anything, and get a reasonably reliable answer.
So when did it go black? When did the curtain close?
Well, so that's 1942. So we think that during the 30s, or I think that during the 30s, he was doing some kind of off the books, but under private auspices development. And when the Navy ordered him to bring that under the wing of the Navy, he resigns from the Navy. And so here's somebody who resigns from the Navy under questionable circumstances, mysterious circumstances, in 1942. And just a few weeks later, he shows up at the Vega Aircraft Facility in Burbank, California, which was the kernel facility that would go on years later to become Skunk Works. So long story short, he essentially winds up at Skunk Works.
So he launched Skunk Works. I mean, he was there in the very early days.
He was there before Skunk Works became Skunk Works.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why we don't know anything about this guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's unreasonable to speculate that he was experimenting with alternate forms of propulsion
100%
and communication.
Right.
And where it gets murkier is after the Vega airplane experience, he moves his entire family to a remote valley along the Nepali coast of Kauai, about as remote as you can get. And he begins working at a facility for the Navy now, back under the Navy wing in Pearl Harbor. And where the story gets really murky is after he does a demonstration of two things at Pearl Harbor. And now this is all coming to me through my covert source that I codenamed Morgan. And Morgan tells me that he demonstrated two things based on his earlier discoveries. One was a propulsion device, and the other was a communications device. And something happened at this demonstration. And the way I understand it was there was present at this Pearl Harbor facility on Barbers Point a mole and somebody who was part of the Kim Philby intelligence network that was working for the Soviet Union. Philby, Burgess, and McLean was a notorious intelligence counter-espionage operation, and they all wound up living in Russia. After World War II, the Cambridge Five, they were known as, and they were members of Britain's upper crust that had very leftist leanings. They kind of affiliated themselves with intelligence interests in the Soviet Union and were providing intelligence. So were spying for the Soviet Union, and one of their sleeper agents, one of their operatives, was somewhere in Pearl Harbor. Now, I don't know what happened precisely, but some kernel of what was being discussed at this demonstration for the brass was observed by somebody who was not supposed to see it. And at that point, it is taken even darker. And the communications system was removed entirely by the Caroline Group, taken where I know not where, but it was taken away completely. And if you want later, I'll try to explain what this communication system is. And Townsend goes on I don't know what became of the propulsion system, but Townsend then goes on a campaign through the 1950s of distraction. There are two ways that the Biefeld-Brown effect manifests, with either a solid dielectric or a fluid dielectric. And when the fluid dielectric is demonstrated using air, it generates something called ion wind. And so what Brown observed can be dismissed as a common physics phenomenon called ion wind. And so while people are saying, oh, that's just ion wind, what's really being developed with the solid dielectric is being developed elsewhere. And then we get into the period in the 1950s where there is some genuine interest in gravity control. And there are conferences held, and there are newspaper articles printed, one of which lands on Nick Cook's desk in the year 1998 or 99 that sends him down the rabbit hole.
There was one that had an image of something.
The G engines are coming.
The G engines are coming, right.
We'll be able to pull that one
Yeah,
up.
Ryan will pull that up. But that's like that got everybody excited. Within just a couple of years, we'll have mastered gravity in the 50s, and then you hear nothing about it.
Right. There was one article in a magazine called Interavia. The title was "Flight Without Stress or Strain."
What did they know?
There it is, the G engine. Yeah. So
there was this kind of almost like a campaign to discredit because of this spy, because of this possibility that this information was going to get leaked, that he and others around him had to attempt to throw dirt on his own already top secret work. Yeah.
So we'll cover it up with a layer of subterfuge, which is easily dismissed. And once you've dismissed the subterfuge, you don't dig any deeper.
Right. So the implication of this is huge. And if that just throwing dirt on this whole thing is true, then that would have lasted until today, essentially. No. No. I mean, so the implication of this is
Ryan, check the gates.
Yeah, right, exactly, right.
You got the closed circuit on the gates, Ryan. They're coming to take us away.
Yeah, we're screwed. But if Jesse's still good, we should still be good, I feel like.
Okay.
So again, the implication is that T. Townsend Brown figured out how to, we'll call it master gravity, that he figured out a way to create propulsion that required essentially almost no energy.
Yeah.
I mean, just very little energy. You're talking about at the atomic level energy that's creating to propel objects around.
Right.
And diving a little bit further into the speculation would be that a lot of the UFO phenomenon and the stuff that we're seeing and documenting today, the Nimitz event, but even going back to the 40s, 1947 with the Roswell incident, sure seems like, a capacitor, like two charged disks could be at the core of whatever crashed in Roswell, potentially. The 1952 incident over the Capitol building where people had all seen, and it's all the Foo Fighters. I mean, it's all these bright orange colored objects that, if the charge is high enough, and you're charging that, and then, the 60s with this incident in Australia, you've got the one that can't be explained for me is the aerial incident in Zimbabwe in in the 90s. I think it was 96, where you've got
the school children,
80 school children that have all seen a craft land and then a being come out and communicate with them telepathically. Obviously, you're talking about something otherworldly or future human as it relates to that. But a lot of the stuff, I mean, the Nimitz incident with the Tic Tac, pilot sightings where they're seeing, Ryan Graves is seeing these things off of the coast of Virginia, where objects are just, they're able to do exactly what this technology should be allowing them to do. We talked, Ashton Forbes, I mentioned at dinner last night, with MH370, 367, I always forget. 70, thank you. That one's a little bit more, I mean, that's, other than that video, it's not like we have witnesses for that one, but it still makes you think. It makes you wonder, and so and then the videos that were released in 2017, potentially even going back to the Phoenix Lights incident, so it feels like a lot of these incidents could be explained through this technology, but this cover up or this attempt to throw dirt on this topic back in the 50s due to this spy incident, it would have had to been overwhelmingly successful in order for countries like Russia, countries like China to not go down this path themselves. There's only a couple of options here. And one is that, the technology's there. We see the technology. As far as I'm concerned, it's almost 100% that this isn't some big psyop, that there's some phenomenon happening with craft that we don't understand and that we don't understand yet. So the phenomenon certainly appears to be real. Where did it come from? Is it extraterrestrial? Is it human? There's only a couple of options. Is it some black budget technology, or is it extraterrestrial? Is it future human? Is it interdimensional? Whatever. But if it is U.S. tech and that can be used to explain a lot of this, that all goes straight back to Townsend Brown, potentially, right?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And then when we're having that kind of a discussion, what was the word you just used? PSYOP. Yeah. When we're talking about PSYOPs, this is where I come against my own wall on all this material, because in order for what you just said to be true, that this stuff has been developed and has been developed in the black, and that it maybe begins with Townsend Brown. If that's true, how are they able to conceal it?
Right.
That runs up against my capacity to comprehend the ability to conduct a PSYOP like that. And so the best we can come to is that pieces of it leak out from time to time and they get quickly covered up. But it's a tough hill to climb. That all this stuff is going on, but they've been able, for the most part, to conceal it.
See, it's not hard for me to imagine that they can conceal it just because of, the way that you're not able to learn anything about Townsend Brown. Like, you're not able to get at those details. That's how they conceal it, by destroying the records, by hiding it, by threatening people, by telling them they're going to kill their families, by actually killing people. I mean, the CIA, it's not historically going back, it's not the most friendly group of people that we've ever seen in our lives. What's more challenging for me to overcome in this scenario, which absolutely has a probability of being true, as it relates to this being U.S. government tech. The part that I struggle with is just that other countries haven't also. It seems to be like more of a United States thing, like if it exists. Like, we're not seeing Russia, China come out, and you're not seeing the sightings over there as much as you are over here. You're not seeing. It feels like somebody, if the technology was able to be developed almost 100 years ago to create some of these crafts, then shouldn't North Korea have it by now? I mean, shouldn't some other countries other than Russia, China, who are trying to keep it secret, be like, hey, I want to brag about this. I got this, man. I've mastered gravity. Like, shouldn't they be able to monetize that somehow? And like, that's the part that I struggle with.
Yeah, right. I wonder if the origin of the phenomenon that you described begins after World War II with Project Paperclip. So you're pointing out that if what we're talking about has been developed, it's only been developed here, and that may start with bringing the whatever German scientists were involved in anything closely related to this. Because remember, we talked about the Foo Fighters, which were a phenomenon that appeared in the skies over Germany in the closing weeks of World War II. And there's a story in the book about Townsend Brown going to Germany to investigate that phenomenon, and so looking and actively looking for certain scientists in Germany who were not part of Project Paperclip. So it is fathomable that certain elements that were pursuing the same lines of research were in fact brought here. And that would explain why that work was only being done here and not somewhere else. And not enough of the actual nuts and bolts of it has gotten far enough out of the black box that somebody like Russia or North Korea or China has the ability to explore it.
Yeah, I mean, one of these wild, freaking crazy answers is the answer, right? It's like we got to pick one. I think that's where, like, who knows what the truth is, and that's why it's frustrating, why it's fascinating, and why it's incredible that there's only been. Seems like, I mean, your book, Jesse Michaels' documentary, now we're talking about it. I mean, it's just incredible that more people haven't kind of approached this topic and attempted to dive into the Townsend Brown mystery, because it could potentially be such a huge part of this entire UAP phenomenon, of this entire, black budget. Like, where's the money going? Where's all this money the Pentagon is spending? It could easily just be directly correlated to that, and answer a lot of questions that we have. So I guess the challenging, tricky, frustrating part is, of course, that is getting to that information and knowing that it's all been suppressed and that it's intentionally been hidden from us by the entity to which we pay taxes, that it is there to supposedly protect us, that is keeping us from understanding the truth, the nature of reality, the nature of our history, and it's about the most frustrating thing that you can imagine. And yet we're just, we just sit here and continue to pay taxes and continue to, pledge our allegiance to these people that are. Yeah.
Don't suck me down the political rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, I'll try not to.
I hear what you're saying, and I'm sympathetic, but
yeah.
I have an idea.
Yeah.
Let's take another break.
Yeah, let's do it.
And when we come back, we can talk about the things that these two stories have in common.
Good.
And what they possibly portend for the future of human civilization.
Love it. Okay. Love it. We'll do it. Good stuff. All right, good. Well, welcome back.
Good to be here.
Good little
Thanks
lunch.
for lunch.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we'll wrap it up. I know that there's the handful of more points that you wanted to cover that are going to be fascinating. So we'll dive into that. But maybe just to start it off, I mean, what is the just double click again for me on the common thread between the Townsworth and the the Farnsworth and the Brown story, if you could.
What these two stories that I've written books about seem to have in common is that they both identify what I call the missing fourths. So we're talking about the fourth way of generating nuclear energy and the fourth fundamental force in the universe. So we'll start there.
Okay.
Science has identified four fundamental forces, or they're called interactions, because there's some debate as to whether or not the fourth, gravity, is a force, but we're not going to go there today. So the four fundamental interactions, as they're now called, are electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, which is radiation essentially, and we use in medical technology, for example, the strong nuclear force, which is nuclear energy or atomic bombs. And then the fourth is gravity. And the only thing we have figured out what to do with gravity is fall down and drop things. So we have total mastery of electromagnetism, and we have some mastery over the two nuclear forces, but none over gravity.
Right.
So implied in the story of Townsend Brown is that he found some way to, if not master gravity, at least to control it and to use it to industrial advantage.
He's not really using it though, right? He's using charged plates to accelerate and to move through areas that do have gravity. So you're not talking about a vacuum, but he's not. Is he actually using gravity itself?
The question there is, does that capacitance device that we talked about earlier, does it generate a synthetic magnetic gravitational field?
Right.
And I don't have an answer to that. I think your point is well taken, that we're talking about a form of thrust, and we don't have any conclusive evidence that it is in fact a form of gravity control. But I need that in order to get to the next one, and to get to where we're ultimately going with that.
I mean, space-time exists, right? So, I mean, when you see these things accelerate at crazy speeds, if there's something in that craft, it's dead. It dies. Unless you're manipulating the space-time in front of you and moving through it. But
Right.
if it's just a gravitational thing where you're just, ignoring the effects of gravity, then that acceleration would be real, it seems like.
Yeah.
So it's like, for me, gravity is not really a force. It's just like, it's something that you can calculate. It's something that exists as space-time that's being manipulated. And it feels like Einstein proved that. And like he showed that gravity wasn't a real force, and that, that it was just an outcome. And Mercury orbiting around the sun breaks down those equations that Newton came up with regarding gravity. So I feel like gravity is not really a force, and now they're just renaming it to be to kind of keep it with the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force and electromagnetism. But I don't know. That's probably a little bit too deep of a rabbit hole to go into. But whatever it is, however he did it, he's creating a thrust. Whether or not he's manipulating gravity or he's just allowing a thrust to occur, regardless of the strength of the gravity, he's creating a thrust.
But if we're talking about craft that have the ability to accelerate to high G-forces, you'd have to have an artificial gravitational field of G1 within that craft in order not to kill the occupants.
Maybe.
Yeah. well, again, we've opened door number 5 now. And we're trying to speculate on what we know, what we don't know, what's been hidden, what's been revealed, and so I've been able to formulate an idea about what these two stories have in common, or where they would tie together. If we can accept, for the purposes of this discussion, that capacitor device that we've been talking about has some impact on the space-time continuum around it. All right? But in order for that to happen, it needs to be powered to very high voltages. And in order for that to happen in a vessel or some means of conveyance, the way that voltage is generated has to be compact and lightweight enough to fit in the vessel. We use the analogy of an automobile. The engine in an automobile is small enough that it can generate the propulsion that that vehicle needs in a self-contained unit. So in order to have a self-contained vessel that's capable of perhaps interstellar travel, you need, and we assume that we're bending space and time around that vessel, we need some way to generate the electricity that allows that to happen through the Biefeld-Brown effect. With you?
Yeah, pretty much.
So
pretty
that
much.
brings us back to the Farnsworth story and missing fourth, number 4, which is the missing form of releasing nuclear energy. So there are 4 ways of releasing nuclear energy. 2 of them are explosive, and 2 of them are controlled. 2 of them involve fission, which is splitting atoms, and 2 of them involve fusion, which is fusing light atoms. The first we mastered was controlled fission. That was when, as part of the Manhattan Project, Enrico Fermi built the Fermi pile under the grandstand at the University of Chicago, which is essentially the first controlled nuclear reactor. They took everything they learned on that to Los Alamos and built the second form, which was the explosive fission reaction. Big boy, little boy, the Trinity experiment. That's explosive nuclear fission. The next one we mastered was explosive fusion. And that was the super that the character of Edwin Teller is talking about at Los Alamos. He wants to go straight from the fission bomb to the fusion bomb, which will give you much more bang for your mass, your buck of mass, in effect. And Oppenheimer in the movie correctly points out to him, you can't generate enough heat or energy to fuse hydrogen atoms unless you use a fission bomb to do it. So that's what they figured out in the 1950s, how to use a fission bomb to trigger a fusion bomb, a hydrogen bomb. So now we have 3 of the 4 ways of releasing atomic energy. The most desirable is controlled fusion. That's where you have a reactor that is combining hydrogen atoms into helium atoms and generating electricity directly as a result. And science has been trying to figure that out for at least 80 years. And my experience of the Farnsworth story lets me believe that Farnsworth may have figured it out. And I make the case that even when he started working on television, that he was already keyed into a different understanding of the fundamental principles of the universe that led him to television. It led him to how to create a video signal in a vacuum tube. That came from his fundamental understanding, which he then developed through the 1930s and 40s. There is another story from the 1940s. Now, he had retired, Farnsworth had retired to Maine. He was kind of burned out on his whole experience in the television business and the things that he had to go through. He retreats to Maine. He builds a laboratory there. And at one point, he is visited by somebody who hops, skips, puddle jumps a flight from somewhere, probably Chicago, to Farmington, Maine, and invites him to be part of a secret project in Chicago. And Farnsworth says to his wife, I think they're trying to build an atomic bomb, and I want nothing to do with it. So he was arguably the most knowledgeable person of the quantum realm of all the people living at that time, and certainly all the people at Los Alamos. So he may be the one person with the most knowledge in that realm who did not go to Los Alamos. Instead, he built test experimental tubes in his laboratory in Maine, one of which was a reiteration of a phenomenon he had observed in his laboratory in Philadelphia in the 1930s when he invented a super amplifier tube called a multipactor tube. And simply put, as much as I can, it used a phenomenon called secondary electron emissions multiplied by radio waves to produce what was called a cold cathode amplifier. Whereas most amplifiers, they use a heated filament. This was a cold cathode, but produced prodigious amounts of signal amplification. That was the multi-pactor tube. He built experimental models of that in the 30s. One of them was spherical. He built a spherical multi-pactor tube, and he observed a kind of a blue glow hovering in the center of that, which may have been an early form of a plasma. But he made a note of that. And when he gets to Maine, he's wondering what he observed there. And by then, maybe the idea of controlled fusion is beginning to percolate through the circuitry. I mean, certainly we know they're trying to build bombs in Los Alamos. And that's where his mind went. So he started formulating his own unique form of math in order to find an approach to bottling the star. Again, we'll go back to the riddle of nuclear fusion, which has baffled science for 80 years, is how do you bottle a star? Because when you're talking about a controlled fusion reaction, you're talking about essentially a star. Every star in the heavens is a fusion reaction. So we want to bottle a miniature star. What kind of container can you build that either the container is not destroyed by the heat of the star or the container doesn't extinguish the star? That's the riddle of nuclear fusion. And right now, corporate science, massive science, industrial science is spending billions of dollars on massive machines to do that. And Farnsworth thought he might have an approach in that glow that he had seen in his spherical multi-pactor tubes.
The blue plasma glow.
The blue plasma. He's still just thinking about this. And remember when I started the Farnsworth story, I said that his approach to things was he decided to think about television because he thought it would be a good thing to invent to launch a career as an inventor. And I think he may have had a similar framing for the work around nuclear fusion, that this might be a good thing to leave as my last great case. And the irony here is that, as his son said to me, Philo III, his father had two great cases in his life, television and nuclear fusion. The first should have given him the means to deliver the second, but it did not, because of all the hassles that he had to go through. He should have come out of the 1930s with his own company that had the means for him to do whatever he wanted after that. But that was not the case because he had to go into manufacturing. The company faltered. It was sold. He was no longer the master of his own destiny, but he was still the master of his own thoughts. And this is where the thought was taking him. So he begins to formulate some ideas. And in 1948, he was in New York for a board meeting of Farnsworth Television and Radio. And he's visiting the apartment of a friend. I think his name was Arthur Reber. And he sees a painted portrait of Albert Einstein on Reber's wall. And it turns out that this was a portrait that Reber's mother had painted. That was the only time Einstein ever sat for a painted portrait. And Farnsworth says, I've got all these ideas. I'd love to talk to Einstein about it. And Reber says, okay, I'll get him on the phone for you. And Reber disappears into the bedroom, and he comes out a few minutes later and he says, I have Einstein on the phone, and he'd love to talk to you. And so Philo Farnsworth goes into the room, and he spends about 45 minutes on the phone with Albert Einstein. Did you ever see Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston?
No, but I know of it.
Well, when Moses goes up the mountain to get the Ten Commandments, he's haggard and straggled, and he's a mess because he's been in the desert. When he comes down, he's all aglow because he's been talking to the burning bush and has been handed the tablets. That's kind of how I picture Farnsworth coming out of Al Reber's bedroom after getting off the phone with Albert Einstein.
He's tripping.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's gone back to the well. He's gone back to the source.
Right.
And Einstein, at this point in his career, he was not really depressed, but he was mortified at what had become of his work at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he had been a pacifist all of his life, had to leave Germany to get away from Adolf Hitler. He'd been a pacifist all his life and was, I think, saddened by the use of nuclear weapons. So when Farnsworth told him what he was thinking, what his approach to controlled nuclear fusion was, Einstein said to him, "You must continue this work. This is the good part of my work, and you must continue this." Because he understood what the potential was for a clean, safe, and inexhaustible source of energy, rather than
what we have today.
What we have now. And Farnsworth was developing some novel math to validate his approach, and Einstein encouraged him to publish the math. So
that's cool.
There's a story in the book where the family is driving to Utah from Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1953, where Farnsworth was going to be bestowed an honor by the National Association of Broadcasters. And he slumped down on the front seat of the car with his fedora pulled over his head, and everybody's, just kind of lost in the ennui of driving across the desert in the summer heat with no air conditioned. And suddenly he bolts out of the front seat and says, "I've got it." He had had a moment of conception analogous to that moment on the field in Rigby in 1921. He suddenly saw how that multi-pactor tube had the properties required to bottle a star. That was 1953. He spent 6 years doing the math. And all he had at his disposal was what his son described as a one-armed bandit of an adding machine, something called a Monroe calculator, where he would punch in a bunch of numbers and pull a lever, and it would run a calculation, and you'd punch in a bunch of numbers and pull a lever. That was all he had at his disposal to develop this cosmology that would enable him to bottle a star. He started building devices in 1959. We've got some photos of that first device, and then went on to build very sophisticated devices using a principle called electrostatic confinement. The work that's being done in fusion now is mostly around the concept of magnetic confinement. We will use the brute force of giant magnets to whirl the plasma around in a donut of hot gas, and fusion will occur based on some probability model if we use these giant magnets. Farnsworth was drawing on the properties of the particles themselves to draw themselves into a knot and cause fusion to happen. I'll just simplify it to that. And it all happens in a container roughly the size of a basketball. Very simple. And the record shows that while these other experiments that I'm talking about have a runtime in seconds, minutes at the most, the Farnsworth fusor, it's called, was tested and run in operations that were sustainable and controlled by the operator for as long as they wanted it to go. It was a controlled and sustained fusion reaction. Now, the remaining hill to climb is, there's a schematic of what a variation looks like. You are putting energy into this in order to cause the reaction to happen. What nobody has achieved yet is the break even, where you're getting more energy out of the reaction than is going in to cause it. And there's a story in the Farnsworth canon where he may have seen something that suggested the path that he needed to get to that. And I won't recount that story for now. Where do you want me to? I feel like I've been doing a monologue here for a while. Maybe I should try to.
This one's confusing. There's a lot here. So I'm just listening and trying to take it in and understand as much as possible. But this one is
okay. Well, then I'll give a little. We're going to get to the point where Farnsworth seems to walk away from what he's done.
Okay.
And so maybe we need to understand a little bit about what the motivation there was. First of all, there was his experience during the years when he was developing television, when he had to fight other corporations for the rights to his own invention, and all the stress and turmoil that caused. So that's one factor. Now, by the time he's developing the fusion work, he is no longer the master of his own destiny because the company was sold to IT&T. So he has to go with his hat in his hand to his superiors at ITT to get the funding for these experiments. And ITT just says, we're not in the atomic energy business. But he had a champion there, a man named Fred Firth, Admiral Fred Firth, who told ITT to give him the money to begin doing this work. But when he wasn't producing meaningful results yet, ITT brought in, they made him hire a recently graduated PhD in physics from the University of Illinois named Robert Hirsch. And Hirsch approached Farnsworth's approach with his own ideas. And there was actually competition going on in the laboratory between the two different approaches. But they were generating enormous neutron counts. That's the measure of, do you have fusion going? Because each fusion reaction spins off a neutron. So if you have enormous neutron counts, you have lots of fusion going on. So they were making substantial progress. And so that's the second factor, is that he is concerned about the institutional governance and how this revolutionary technology would be absorbed into the culture. And the third thing was he had moments of conscience where he was not at all certain that mankind was ready for what he was trying to develop. He could, because of his vantage point at the pinnacle of the quantum realm in nuclear physics, he could imagine the civilization that might result if this technology was available. But then he would turn around and see what mankind was doing with the technology we already have at our disposal and wonder, do we really want them to have this? And you can raise the question, does he have the right to make that judgment? I don't know. But apparently he did. So,
I mean, if you give any of this technology to prior civilizations, if you give it to the Romans, if you give it to the Sumerians, to the Egyptians, to any, I mean, we're not here today. You know, I think it's highly unlikely that we're here today. It's just mankind was not ready for it in the past, and arguably is not ready. The story hasn't been written yet, you know, but is very likely not ready for it right now.
He had bouts of conscience,
right?
And he said to his wife one time, a fusion-powered laser beam could burn a hole through the moon. Is one thing, and I know it's kind of hard to imagine what could be worse than a hydrogen bomb. And if there's something better to be had from it, shouldn't we have that? But I think he had ideas about how the controlled energy could be used that would be diabolical.
Yeah, I mean, you can transport whatever, in nuclear material, nuclear weapons, instantly to any point in the world as an individual, if that technology existed for people just publicly. So, it's all it takes is one crazy person. So, are we ready for it? No. We're, but
well,
it
I'm
is.
not going to argue with you. On that point. Yeah.
I mean, it is helping us grow up a little bit faster. I think it is leading to some awakening of the human species from a standpoint of this is real, this is here, this is now. There are people that control this technology and these weapons. It's the government, it's the people in power, and how are they using it? Well, they're not really using the nuclear powered stuff in war right now because they know that that's going to escalate and that's going to lead to destruction. But we're not ready for it.
Well, remember I was saying that he was developing his own cosmology and his own math. Yeah. And he discussed that math with Einstein, and Einstein told him he should publish that math. So on some level, he is using these experiments with fusion technology to validate his cosmology, his understanding of what happens at the subatomic level. And I think that's a fairly common phenomenon. If you don't believe me, I'll build it and prove it to you. But given all these other reservations he had, he was being very circumspect. But there is a story where he comes home from the laboratory one afternoon in about 1965, maybe 66, and his wife sees an unusual expression on his face. That's Pam. And she asks him, what's up? And he says, well, I saw something today, and I want you to come back to the lab with me tonight and see it. So they do. They go back to the lab, and now I'm going to quote the scene in E.T. where the laboratory is all wrapped up and everybody has to sneak in. He had to kind of sneak into his own lab. And the fuser itself is wrapped up in some supporting equipment and buried in a, not buried, but down in a pit in the basement of the building where they worked, on Pontiac Street in Fort Wayne, because there is radiation involved and you have to have shielding from the radiation. And so to protect themselves from the radiation, they buried this thing in a pit. So the fuser is still in the pit, and it's just a matter of electronic controls and gauges that show you what the results are. Phil sits down at the controls, Pem sits down at the gauges. And Phil starts running the voltage up, and it runs into the 25 to 30 kilovolt range where the reaction begins to occur. And he gets the voltage up to a certain level, and he asks Pem, where are the needles? And I'm sorry, I left out an important detail. So what we're trying to get here is a self-sustaining reaction. That's the first step to a net gain reaction, a reaction that will sustain itself from the energy that's being produced in the reaction. Sorry, I didn't include that detail because that's what we're looking for. So Phil is at the controls. He pushes the voltage up. He calls to Pem, where are the gauges? She says they're about 3/4 of the way up. He pushes the throttles up a little further. Where are they? Well, they're getting near the ledge, getting near the edge. He pushes them a little forward and she shouts, they're pegged. And the needles are all pegged. And he lets it sit for a second, and then he starts pulling the voltage away. And the needles stayed pegged.
So
for about 30 seconds.
Okay.
Long enough for him to see whatever it was. And he turned to Pam and he said, I've seen what I need to see. That's it. Let's go home. Shuts the whole thing down. They go home. Something happened that night that Pam Farnsworth would not tell me about until I had known her for 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
And that's what she told you.
That was the story she told
me.
Yeah, that's in my book. It's also in her book.
Wow.
And I like to think of that as, I use the example I told you at the very beginning about the apocryphal story about the kid in the doorway watching his father and father putting a piece on the shelf. When I shared that apocryphal story with Philo T. Farnsworth III, after I'd known him for a while, he said it wasn't really like that, but the patents are incomplete. Something was left out of the patents. Yeah. And that might have been the missing ingredient that he recognized the potential in. So if you can build the device, but you're not going to get it to work the way he thought it would. Anyway, the reason I'm going into all this is because when I then got dragged into the Townsend Brown story, one of the amazing things that happened in the very early days was when I first met Linda Brown, and we met in a hotel in Las Vegas, and she brought these 2 Rubbermaid tubs with what she had left of her father's archives. We're rifling through it, and you know what came out? Farnsworth's fusion patent was in Townsend Brown's records. I've developed this theory that if there are advanced civilizations gallivanting around the galaxy, their vessels use some form of gravity control, which is empowered by megavolts generated by an electrostatic fusion reactor. Mm. So it's those 2 ingredients. Mm-hmm. It's like the fuser is the engine and the gravity control is the differential delivering the drive to the wheels. When I'm looking for the common thread that seems to cause these 2 stories to resonate together in a way that suggests what I just said about fusion-powered gravity control, there's one story in each of them. When Townsend Brown was courting Josephine, the woman who would become his wife, he found in her somebody that he felt like he could confide his secrets in. And in 1926, he takes her sailing on Buckeye Lake. And he starts talking about what some of his ideas are. And the story is that Josephine asks him, so, Mr. Smarty Pants, what do you see for mankind in the future? And Townsend takes a beat and says, we'll just sail away. She says, what do you mean? Someday, mankind will push away from the earth as easily as this boat pushed away from the dock. So that was his vision for what he was experimenting with. There's a corollary story in the Farnsworth story. When the space race got going, and that's in the same time frame where he is thinking about and developing nuclear fusion, he said this about space travel. The way we get into space now is a relationship between chemical combustion and payload that is like a pineapple and a pea. We need a launch vehicle the size of a pineapple to lift a payload the size of a pea. Because most of the fuel at launch is burned getting the rest of the fuel off the launch pad.
Right.
He imagined that with fusion energy, particularly the way he envisioned it in the electrostatic confinement model, that those ratios would be reversed and that you would be able to have a launch vehicle the size of a pea that would lift a payload the size of a pineapple. And I don't know that he was specifically thinking in terms of any kind of gravity manipulation or gravity control, but you can see kind of the corollary construction there, where Townsend Brown is talking about just pushing away from the Earth like a boat pushes away from a dock, and Farnsworth is talking about lifting a large payload gently with some kind of very small, lightweight, reactive propulsion system. So I indulge myself in the corollary in those two stories. And this whole idea that mankind has mastered 3 of the fundamental forces and 3 of the ways of withholding nuclear energy. And for some reason, we cannot get through the threshold to the 2 missing fourths.
Or can we?
Or maybe we have.
Maybe we have.
Maybe we have. Yeah. I would. We are making the case for that possibility.
Yeah, for sure.
And then raising all the questions about why don't we have it?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that takes the whole conversation into an entirely different thread. Because now we're talking about human evolution.
Which, if Townsworth and Farnsworth and Brown are intertwined and can't be separated in your mind, that can't be separated in my mind. You know, So I mean, that's really the question. What I mean, do you think? I mean, just let's get into speculative world now, as long as we're closing it out. Right. You know, I mean.
Well, before we do, let me just
sure.
say, I mean, you know, this is the thread that has defined my adult life, and I've been on this now for 50 years. And it was triggered for me on that hillside in Santa Cruz when I heard this story about nuclear fusion and the part that was left on the shelf, the apocryphal story. That was the harpoon that sank into my soul. And when I got into this idea of doing a movie for television, I was always intrigued by what was the rest of the story. And then I did a book, and then I needed another book. And that led me to the Townsend Brown thing and the tub of archives that had the Farnsworth fusion patent in it. So they do seem connected.
Yeah, for sure, no doubt about it. What about Hal Puthoff? How does he factor into this?
I've been Hal Puthoff's name has been on the tip of my tongue since we sat down.
Has
here.
it? Okay,
yeah,
all right.
For 2 reasons.
Okay.
So I've watched several of Hal's videos. Hal figures very prominently in Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point, which was really the first time that Townsend Brown gained any profile or visibility in the 21st century. And there's a lot of interesting sidebars to that, but Hal has some coverage there.
Tell people just real quick who he is and how he relates to the topic.
I don't know enough about Hal Puthoff to say other than he's a man who has had his fingers in countless pies over the course of science history. Right. He was instrumental in the development of the remote viewing program at Stanford Research Institute, SRI. And another sidebar there is that it's not covered in my book at all because we know so little about it, but Brown was also at the Stanford Research Institute during that time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
they knew each other.
But Hal has said 2 things that get my attention. When you were talking earlier about, we were talking about the negative and positive plates, the positive plate chasing the negative plate. And you were envisioning a saucer that might have been constructed with the negative plate at the top and the positive plate at the bottom. something that Hal Puthoff has touched on makes me wonder if it's not in the actual fabrication of the metal itself. That somehow the metal is layered in such a way that capacitance effect takes place within the skin of the craft. He was talking about some kind of foreign or alien object recovery, and that they examined the metal and that they found within it, and this is the quotation, layers of barium thinner than a human hair. And so I thought, okay, so they layered the layers of the capacitor into the plate and generate the thrust that way. So that's one thing he said. Layers of, no, it wasn't barium, it was bismuth. Layers of bismuth layered into this metal from this recovered vessel. Just a quick snippet in the middle of something else. And then, yeah, there it is. And then in his conversation, there's a fascinating conversation between Hal Puthoff with Eric Weinstein and Jesse Michaels. And they get into talking about the overt work that was being done in the 1950s around the subject of gravitation and gravity control. And Hal says either there was nothing there or it just went black. Those are the possibilities.
Those are the two possibilities, yeah.
But his reoccurring presence in these stories is a wonder to behold.
Yeah, he knows more than he's allowed to
I think
say.
The one thing we can say with any certainty about Hal Puthoff is that he knows more than he's letting on.
Right. And hopefully, hopefully at some point he comes out and talks. Maybe it's a deathbed thing, who knows? But man, it would be nice to know what that guy knows for sure. Yeah. So, okay. I mean, what else did you? I feel like it's been a fantastic conversation. I mean, I've learned a ton. I've been trying to keep up with you as much as possible. You are light years ahead on this topic. I mean, it's been clear that you've spent decades, studying and researching this.
I know that you've got a biographical sketch on me, but I think it can all be boiled down to something my girlfriend said the other day.
Okay.
I'm a polymath somewhere on the spectrum with ADD. There is the recurring notion that physics has not advanced much since World War II.
Right.
We haven't had any big breakthroughs.
No, there's been no breakthroughs. Yeah. I mean, there's been no breakthroughs in a lot of things in a really long time. That's probably not fair to say, but yeah, it does seem like we should be advancing faster. I mean, with how fast technology is advancing, and I mean, honestly, it feels like AI should help us break through a bunch of stuff like that. The information should be available to the public. It should be. If we can feed enough data into a large language model, then it should be able to spit out some truths for us.
There's only one way that AI can solve any of the riddles.
What?
And that is if AI can tell us with certainty what happens after death. How much of the strife in the world is caused by differing interpretations of the afterlife?
Yeah, for sure.
So if AI can solve that riddle and satisfy everybody that that's the answer, we may have turned a corner.
Yeah, and potentially not just the afterlife. I mean, life itself. What is life? I mean, I think obviously life exists in the afterlife. If there is an afterlife, then it's very clear to see what life is. But AI should be able to tell us what is life, period. What is life right now? And if we can answer that question, maybe we treat each other a little bit differently, and we do have less war and less fighting and less killing of each other and ourselves.
Well, I got an email from somebody recently who represents like a speakers bureau, and he described it as a faith-based speakers bureau. And I just sent him a short note back. I said, well, if by faith-based you mean like Jesus, then it's probably not going to be a good fit. Because what little faith I have is based on the concept of the intelligence of the quantum continuum. And if we can work with that, then we can talk. But I think that there is an intelligence that lives in the quantum continuum, and it sees how we try to make sense of it through all these anthropomorphic representations, like Jesus, and they're just laughing their heads off.
Yeah.
Look what the apes came up with.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What do you think? I mean, in terms of, have you heard of the Schumann resonance?
No.
Okay. So Schumann resonance might be the answer to a handful of your questions or thoughts, or that higher intelligence. It's I mean, near-death experiences, people do see a God. I mean, they interact with a God, of course. It's like they in near-death experiences, people are often taken by beings. They see a tunnel of light. They interact with a God. They have life reviews. I mean, this happens from people all across the world that speak different languages, that have different experiences, that have different beliefs. It's almost never a religious experience or but people do interact with a being that they call God and review their life and past lives and different things. And this is, I think if we're to believe anything, we almost need to attempt to at least stay open-minded to the experiencers, the people who have actually seen and experienced what the afterlife, quote unquote, might look like. So yeah, that's a pretty fascinating exploration for sure. I did a great episode with a near-death experience guy who really kind of opened my mind to new possibilities of the afterlife. And then I did a great episode with a guy named Stefan Burns, who I'm going to have back on the show because he's fantastic. He's brilliant and really opened my mind up to what the Schumann resonance is. And the Schumann resonance is actually it's a frequency that exists. I think the human brain operates at 11 hertz or something like that. Maybe Schumann resonance is a bit lower. I think it's around 7 to 8 hertz, and oftentimes when you take psychedelics, you're lowering your brain's frequency to be within the frequency of the Schumann resonance. And the Schumann resonance is it's information, it's light that has been trapped within the earth since the beginning of time. And so it does capture all of the information that the earth has ever contained and ever has had throughout the earth's history. So this because of the specific frequency, it's the frequency of the earth itself. The light bounces between the surface of the earth and the ionosphere. The surface of the earth and the ionosphere, right, there it is. So within and around us at all times is this information that is potentially the key to understanding the entire nature of reality. Anything that's ever happened and that's ever occurred throughout the history of the earth is trapped between the ionosphere and the surface of the earth. And there's some people who believe that psychedelic experiences or whatever, if you're given these downloads of information, that it's because the frequency within your brain matches the frequency of the Schumann resonance, and your temporal lobe acts as a antenna for being able to receive the information that's naturally circulating around the world. And a lot of people think that, hey, maybe this is why pyramids began to appear in South America at the same time that they were appearing in Egypt, because that information was spreading throughout the world. And these people in South America were doing all this ayahuasca, and so. There's various theories about that, but I think that it's something that's worth exploring as you talk about, this guy talking about God, and talking about being a conduit of the information that he's receiving, right, and allowing that just to flow through him. He sees the information as coming from God, but could that information truly just exist all around him and flow through him? And you can get to that state not just through psychedelic plant medicine, but also through meditation, deep states of meditation. You can get there through breathing. You can get there through, you can lower your brain's frequency through states of meditation. Oftentimes, I think even sleep, lowers. But
well, when you talked to Joe McGonigal about remote viewing, did you ever get into the quantum basis for remote viewing?
No, he didn't. He couldn't explain the science.
Yeah.
He couldn't explain how it worked.
Yeah. Because it suggests to me that knowledge exists on some quantum level.
Right.
And that you have the ability, and that all, like you were saying a moment ago, all knowledge exists simultaneously, past, present, and future.
Right.
Even Einstein said that past, present, and future were fabrications of the mind.
Yeah. Well, the future and the past are certainly fabrications of the mind. The present,
okay,
that would take some convincing. But yeah.
But this idea that all the information is out there somewhere.
Yeah, not that I'm disagreeing with Einstein.
And some people have the ability to tune into different frequencies and pick up different information.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, for sure.
Guys like Philo Farnsworth.
Right.
He arrived with tuned to a certain frequency.
Right.
And he was able to understand Einstein from a very early age.
Right.
And then he found embodied in what he read from Einstein the means to produce pictures that could fly through the air.
Right, exactly. Yeah, for sure.
That led him even deeper into the well.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that he was such a young kid when he came up with this stuff, I mean, it's oftentimes, I think, a lot easier for kids to understand the nature of reality more so than adults, because adults have clouded, they've got these beliefs and these perceptions about what's real and what's not real. Einstein, one of the most open-minded people in, he wasn't like belief-based, close-minded dude. He was constantly. I feel like a lot of his great revelations came to him. This is my understanding based on what I've read about Einstein at points in time where he was in and out of a meditative state.
Sure.
And that's when that information hit him. These new ideas, creativity itself sort of seems to come from not when we're thinking, when we're trying to, remember somebody's name or solve a problem. It's the most difficult time to remember it. But when our brain, when we pause and we just let the information come to us and we can turn that off.
That happens to me all the time when I'm writing.
Right.
I'm working on a project right now, and I'll sit there, type thing, and I just get stuck. And I go into the kitchen to make a sandwich, and suddenly it opens up again. When you stop thinking about it, the solution appears.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, it's all probabilities, right? I mean, it's all, we don't know until it's observed. It's like this big rock that's approaching our solar system, this big interstellar rock, and it's like it could be a kilometer wide, it could be 10 kilometers wide, but we don't know what that is. Everybody's saying, it's a comet, just a big rock, and that's certainly a possibility. But until it's observed, we don't really know what it is. And it's that process of observation that creates reality. Like, we don't know if light is a particle or a wave until we observe it. We don't know if Schrodinger's cat is dead or alive until we observe it. It exists in multiple states until the point at which it's observed. This rock that's approaching us exists in multiple states right now. Until we send a probe out and look at it, or until we get a telescope that can actually see what it is, it exists in all states. And so to say it's one thing or another is just... it's not understanding quantum mechanics and the nature of how things work. And that's just been proven scientifically over and over and over again. So,
well, that speaks to some discussions that I have with the people on the website that I host for further explorations into the Farnsworth approach to fusion. It's fusor.net. If you want to look it up, FUSOR.net. There are people there that are building scale models of the Farnsworth fusion reactor. And I tried to make sometimes the point that you just made, that if you have a certain kind of experience, you're going to learn certain things from that experience. And Farnsworth comes into television or video with some native understanding of the photoelectric effect in the quantum field. He learns more than anybody trying to perfect that, to deliver it to the marketplace. So his experience was different, and he learned things that were different. And I think he brought those to bear when he goes to work on the fusion process. And I just think he was seeing different things than what the rest of us who are, not me personally, but the others who were experimenting, he saw different things that gave him a different perspective. And that comes from the unique experience that is born of the unique work.
Well, very good. Yeah. What else? What else is on your mind?
I have little mind left. I've spilled it all, dude.
Yeah. We've let it all out, right? Yeah.
The only thing that I haven't thought of is the thing that I'll think of as soon as we drive away.
Right. Yeah, exactly. When you stop thinking, it will appear.
But I did remember to go back to show you that lab journal where Pem said maybe not worthy.
Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah.
I've told you all my stories.
Well, good. Yeah, me too. Me too. That's all I know for today. And I think that the topic itself is fascinating. I mean, these are two guys that are just absolute powerhouses in American and human history in terms of what they were able to create and develop. And they're just two of the most unknown, obscure people. I mean, if you were to tell somebody that Townsend Brown potentially created the UAP phenomenon in the 1920s, I mean, people are gonna. It's crazy. Nobody. It's like it's nobody. Yeah.
Or if you tell somebody that a 14-year-old farm boy figured out how to bounce electrons back and forth in a vacuum tube so that we can have cell phones today, that sounds pretty fantastic too.
Exactly.
And that's what I was thinking as you were saying that, is the contrast between the two stories almost encapsulates the whole dilemma of human existence to an extent. There are certain things that we know, there are certain things that we don't know, and certain things we can't know.
Right.
And all of that is embodied in these two stories.
Yep.
We know that television exists. We know that there's a traceable history through that lineage. And so that's fairly concrete. But then you get up to the next electron orbit of the Townsend Brown story, and things start getting pretty fuzzy. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Yeah, for sure. But I mean, I just feel like the way that you've brought these two stories to life, the way that you've connected the two stories, you're doing a service to humanity to be able to understand these two really, really important people that accomplished a tremendous amount in their life and bring their story to people in a way that they can understand. So I really do appreciate the work that you've done. I know you've spent decades on this now, so it's time well spent, because I think that even if it's 10 years from now, even if it's 15 years from now, I feel like the work that you've done to kind of bring this stuff to life and to get it out there into the public so that we can understand it, I think it's the beginning of something that is going to be much bigger 20 years from now, 30 years from now, that people are going to understand and talk about and be able to relate to. So I know sometimes it's hard to see until posthumously, but...
Well, I think I found a note we can end on.
All right.
Which is the very last page of the Townsend Brown biography, which is a quote from a Jackson Browne song. It's for a dancer. The last verse begins with, "Keep a fire for the human race. Let your prayers go drifting into space. You never know what will be coming down. Perhaps a better world is drawing near. Just as easily it could all disappear, along with whatever meaning you might have found." And the verse ends with, "And somewhere between the time you arrive and the time you go, may lie a reason you were alive that you'll never know."
Beautiful. We'll close it with that.
Okay.
All right. Good stuff, my friend.
Thanks for that, Ryan.
I appreciate you.
Okay.